The date is August 8th, 1941. We are on the southern edge of the Eastern Front, specifically the beleaguered outskirts of Belyaevka, Ukraine. The geopolitical situation is catastrophic. The German Wehrmacht, executing Operation Barbarossa, has sent 3 full infantry divisions, Army Group South, to crush the Soviet port city of Odessa. This is not just a skirmish. It is a strategic stranglehold intended to cut off the Soviet Black Sea Fleet. The defenders are outnumbered 3-1. The casualty rates are unsustainable, with units evaporating faster than reserve command can train replacements. In this chaotic vacuum of command and control, a singular, terrifying variable enters the equation. Her name is Lyudmila Pavlichenko. She is 24 years old, a fourth-year history student at Kiev University, and she is currently crouching behind a pile of pulverized masonry with a Mosin-Nagant 1891 over 30 rifle pressed into her shoulder. She has 0 confirmed kills. She has 309 to go. To understand the gravity of this moment, we must analyze the trajectory that brought a scholar to the front lines. 11 days prior, the Luftwaffe conducted a strategic bombing campaign over Kiev. This was not merely a military strike. It was terror bombing designed to break civilian morale. One of those bombs obliterated the main wing of the university. Pavlichenko's mentor, Professor Anatoly Vurov, was buried alive under tons of concrete for 2 hours before recovery teams could extract his body. Her best friend, Natasha, trapped in the library, was consumed by the resulting firestorm. This personal tragedy mirrors the national collapse. The psychological shift in Pavlichenko was instantaneous. The history student died in that library. The soldier was born the next morning. When she arrived at the recruitment office, the chaos of mobilization was in full swing. The recruiting officer, overwhelmed and adhering to traditional gender roles, attempted to divert her to a field hospital. The prevailing logic was biological and social. Women belonged in trauma care, not in the infantry. Combat, he argued, was a visceral reality of blood and panic that the female psyche could not process. Pavlichenko's response was not emotional. It was technical. She presented Voroshilov marksman certification top-tier scores from a paramilitary youth shooting club. When the officer laughed, dismissing target shooting as a parlor game compared to the stress of combat, she demanded a field test. He pointed to a fence post at 100 meters, a difficult target for an iron sight rifle without a rest. Pavlichenko chambered 5 rounds of 7.62 2x 5.4 mmR ammunition. She drilled the center of the post with all 5. The laughter stopped. The officer realized he wasn't looking at a nurse. He was looking at a high-value asset. She was immediately assigned to the 25th Rifle Division. But shooting at wood and paper is physics. Shooting at a living human being is psychology. And on August 8th, Pavlichenko faced her first true test of nerve. Through the crack in a destroyed farmhouse wall, she spotted the glint of a helmet. German optics. A sniper. 280 meters out. He was tracking a Soviet sergeant, Dmitry Kravchenko, a 32-year-old father of 2, who had shared his bread rations with Pavlichenko just hours prior. Kravchenko was exposed, unaware that he was seconds away from execution. This is the sniper's dilemma, the transition from observer to participant. Pavlichenko's instructor's voice echoed in her mind, framing the act not as murder, but as a complex mathematical problem. Variable 1. Distance, 280 meters. Variable 2. Windage, a light crosswind, drifting west. Variable 3. Target state, stationary. It is a cold calculation of ballistics. She settled the crosshairs. The trigger brake on a Mosin-Nagant is heavy, requiring deliberate force. She squeezed. The rifle kicked, the sound cracking across the valley like a whip. Through the scope, the result was binary. The German helmet jerked backward violently, then vanished. Pavlichenko, confused by the supersonic crack of the bullet passing him, looked around. He lived. Pavlichenko cycled the bolt, ejecting the spent casing. She felt no rush of adrenaline, no wave of nausea, no patriotic swell. She felt only the cold efficiency of a job done and the immediate tactical imperative: acquire the next target. This marked the beginning of a rampage that would see her labeled Lady Death. By May 1942, her ledger would hold 309 confirmed kills. However, the statistic that military historians focus on is not the total volume, but the specific subset: 36 enemy snipers. These were not conscripts, they were specialists. To kill a counter-sniper is the apex of infantry warfare, but to reach that level of lethality, Pavlichenko had to survive a brutal learning curve that claimed the lives of her peers. The Soviet sniper doctrine of 1941 was rigid, drawn from outdated manuals that emphasized static concealment over dynamic movement. It was a doctrine that was getting good soldiers killed. Consider the case of Lieutenant Anna Morozova, Pavlichenko's first combat loss. Morozova was a textbook operator, 47 kills, disciplined, adhering strictly to the rulebook. The rule was simple: fire, then move. Never stay in a position for more than 30 minutes. Morozova followed this to the letter. She engaged a machine gun crew from a third-floor apartment, secured the kill, and relocated to the second floor. 20 minutes later, she engaged an officer. Clean kill. She then moved to the ground floor to exit. She was dead before she reached the door. A single 7.92 mm Mauser round to the chest. The German counter-sniper, Hans Becker, a veteran with 89 kills, hadn't just reacted. He had predicted her. He understood the Soviet doctrine better than the Soviets did. He knew that after a shot from the third floor, the Russian would move down. He simply waited at the exit point. This pattern repeated with terrifying frequency. Corporal Viktor Stepanov, 19 years old, set up a perfect textbook ambush in a drainage ditch. Perfect concealment. He took 2 shots, killing 2 Germans. He waited the regulation 15 minutes before preparing to move. A German artillery shell vaporized his position. The Germans had triangulated the acoustic signature of his rifle and, rather than risking a sniper duel, simply saturated the grid square with high explosives. Stepanov died because he was predictable. Pavlichenko watched 7 of her colleagues die in the first month. They were marksmen of the highest order, but they were fighting defensively. They waited for targets to present themselves. They allowed the Germans to dictate the tempo of the engagement. The German counter-sniper units, particularly the specialized times Jaeger times detachments, were aggressive hunters. They didn't wait for targets, they created them. Pavlichenko realized that survival required a radical departure from the manual. The doctrine stated, "Concealment is survival. Exposure is death. Strategically, this makes sense. But tactically, against an enemy who knows your playbook, it is a suicide pact. To defeat the German sharpshooters, she had to reverse the predator-prey dynamic. She had to stop hiding and start hunting. She formulated a plan that would be considered court-martial offenses by her superiors. It involved a tactic so reckless, so counterintuitive, that the Germans would never anticipate it. She decided to stop avoiding detection. Instead, she would deliberately expose herself. She would become the bait. The strategy Pavlichenko devised was a masterclass in asymmetric warfare. In military terms, she was transitioning from a passive defensive posture to an active counteroffensive trap. The concept was the duel nest. Standard operating procedure dictated a single, well-concealed firing position with an escape route. Pavlichenko's innovation was to construct two positions, separated by 4 to 6 meters, a distance she could traverse in under 3 seconds. In the primary nest, she placed the bait. A helmet propped on a stick, a tunic stuffed with straw, or a mannequin head modeled from clay. In the secondary nest, hidden in the peripheral blind spot, sat Pavlichenko. When a German sniper took the shot at the decoy, his muzzle flash would reveal his grid coordinates. He would realize his error within 2 to 4 seconds, the time it takes to cycle a bolt or refocus optics. In that microscopic window of time, Pavlichenko had to acquire the target, calculate the firing solution, and kill him. If she missed, her position was blown, and the German, already aiming in her general direction, would have the advantage. It was a game of Russian roulette, played with high-velocity lead. On September 3, 1941, she initiated the first live test of this suicidal doctrine. The front line had stabilized, with German positions entrenched 340 meters across no man's land. Pavlichenko selected a ruined cellar, a structure that offered deep shadows and damp, cold cover. She established the decoy, a standard-issue Soviet helmet tilted forward to mimic a weary observer in the left window. She positioned herself 5 meters to the right, lying prone in the debris. Then, the hardest part of sniping began. The wait. For 45 minutes, she remained statue still. Muscle atrophy, cramps, and the stinging sweat in the eyes are the sniper's constant companions. At 6:17, the silence shattered. A 7.92 millimeters round slammed into the decoy helmet, spinning it violently. The trap was sprung. Pavlichenko didn't flinch. She scanned. 320 meters out, behind a brick retaining wall, a muzzle flash blossomed. She saw the silhouette of the German shooter shifting, likely preparing to confirm his kill. He was operating on the assumption that the threat was neutralized. That assumption cost him his life. Pavlichenko had a 3-second window. She didn't need 3. The Mosin-Nagant roared. Through her 3.5x PU scope, she saw the figure drop. She didn't wait for confirmation. She abandoned both positions immediately, sprinting 40 meters west to a tertiary observation point. Through her binoculars, she watched 2 Wehrmacht soldiers drag a limp body from behind the wall. The experiment was a success. The hunter had been hunted. Over the next 6 weeks, Pavlichenko refined this methodology with the obsession of a scientist. She began to deconstruct the psychology of the Wehrmacht sniper corps. German training emphasized the high-ground church towers, third-story windows, elevated ridges. It gave them a ballistic advantage and superior field of view. They also preferred to engage with the sun at their backs to eliminate optic glare. Pavlichenko inverted these preferences. She set her decoys to be tantalizingly visible from high angles, while she hid at ground level in the mud, the rubble. The places German officers wouldn't deign to look. She timed her hunts so the sun was in the Germans' eyes, blinding their high-quality Zeiss optics. By October, her personal ledger stood at 78 confirmed kills. 22 of them were enemy snipers. This success created a new kind of weapon. Psychological attrition. Word spread through the Soviet ranks of a woman who collected German snipers like stamps. Officers who had seen their platoons decimated by invisible gunmen began to petition for her services explicitly. They didn't just bring orders. They brought bribes, vodka, extra rations, chocolate, anything to get the sniper hunter in their sector. But it wasn't the bribes that motivated her. It was the memory of Morozova and Stepanov. It was a cold, burning need to balance the scales. On October 12th, a Lieutenant Volkov approached her with a tactical nightmare. His platoon was pinned down near a strategic railway junction. They had lost 9 men in 4 days to a single sniper who was systematically dismantling their command structure. Radio operators, machine gunners, NCOs. This German was a ghost. He never fired from the same spot twice. He left no pattern. Volkov's unit was paralyzed, unable to move supplies or rotate troops. Pavlichenko accepted the contract. She spent the first 2 days doing nothing but watching. She lay 800 meters back, mapping the terrain with the precision of a cartographer. She identified 11 potential firing positions that offered the necessary sightlines. The German was smart. He was using the chaotic geometry of the rail yard to mask his location. But even a ghost has to follow the laws of physics. To shoot, he had to be somewhere. Pavlichenko decided to force his hand. She set a trap 5 meters from where Volkov's men usually gathered. She constructed a high-fidelity decoy resembling a Soviet officer and placed it in a line of sight visible from 8 of the 11 potential German hides. Then she set up her kill zone 12 meters away, aiming at the most unlikely spot, a destroyed boxcar in the middle of the tracks. The boxcar was a counterintuitive position. It was thin metal, offering 0 ballistic protection against heavy-caliber rounds or shrapnel. Soviet artillery could turn it into a cheese grater in seconds, but the German had made a calculated economic risk. He bet that the Soviets wouldn't waste expensive artillery shells on a single empty train car. At 7-11, the gamble failed. The German took the bait, putting a round through the decoy. Pavlichenko saw the muzzle flash inside the dark maw of the boxcar door. He was 420 meters out a long shot for iron sights, but manageable for a scope. The German was moving, preparing to relocate. He had roughly 5 seconds before he vanished into the rail yard labyrinth. The bullet punched through the thin steel of the car or through the open door. Visuals were unclear, but the reaction was unmistakable. The figure jerked but didn't fall. She had wounded him. As he stumbled, trying to scramble out the back, she chambered a second round. The follow-up shot dropped him. When Volkov's men cleared the car, they found a master sergeant with 67 kills in his logbook. He had been shot through the shoulder and the head. Pavlichenko's response to Volkov's awe was characteristic. Simple mathematics. I made him shoot first. By late 1941, the German command could no longer ignore the threat. They placed a bounty on her head. Initially 100 Reichsmarks, it quickly escalated to 1,000. German propaganda broadcasts began to specifically target her, calling her the Devil Woman, or claiming she was a myth, a fictional character created by the commissars to boost morale. They argued that no woman could possess the biological capability for such slaughter. Pavlichenko found this amusing. Their denial was their weakness. She began leaving calling cards, a piece of red ribbon tied near a shooting position, or the Red Queen playing card left on the bodies of dead snipers she managed to search. It was theatrical, yes, but it served a strategic purpose. It induced paranoia. Every time a German soldier saw a piece of red fabric, he hesitated. And in war, hesitation is death. But the defining moment of her career, the duel that would cement her legend, was approaching. In November, the German war machine turned its full attention to Sevastopol. The siege was tightening. Food was scarce, ammunition was rationed, and the city was crumbling. Into this cauldron stepped a German adversary of equal skill, a sniper who had killed 11 Soviet officers in 3 days. He was decapitating the leadership of the defense sector. Major Chernov called Pavlichenko to headquarters and laid out the photos of the dead. Precision shots. No wounded. This was an apex predator. The command gave her 48 hours to eliminate him, or the sector would collapse due to a breakdown in the chain of command. Pavlichenko looked at the maps. The stage was set for a confrontation between the two deadliest individuals on the Crimean Peninsula. November 1941. The Siege of Sevastopol. This was not merely a battle. It was a meat grinder of attrition warfare. The city was encircled, subjected to the heaviest artillery bombardment in human history up to that point, including the use of the massive Schwerer Gustav railway gun. Inside this cauldron, Lyudmila Pavlichenko faced the ultimate test of her doctrine. The German adversary was a ghost, a specialist who had effectively paralyzed the Soviet command sector by eliminating officers during the chaotic morning shift changes. Pavlichenko's investigation was forensic. She ignored the bodies and studied the geometry. Every kill occurred between 5:45 and 7:30. Every shot was a single round to the head or chest. The German was exploiting the dawn blind, that specific window of low light when tired night shifts swap with groggy day shifts. He was hacking the Soviet routine, working with Lieutenant Boris, a reconnaissance specialist who knew every sewer line and attic in the ruins. Pavlichenko walked the perimeter under the cover of darkness. She identified 14 potential sniper hides that offered the necessary sight lines to the Soviet command post. It was too many to cover. She had to force a mistake. She narrowed the list to 3. A destroyed church tower, a collapsed apartment complex, and a school rooftop. These offered the elevation and escape routes a professional would demand. Then, she made the decision that defines her legacy. She realized that decoys would no longer work. This German was too experienced to shoot at a helmet on a stick. He needed a target that justified the risk of firing. He needed an officer. On November 8th, at 5:42, Pavlichenko walked out into the open near the command post. She was wearing a borrowed lieutenant's greatcoat, too large, but unmistakable in silhouette. She wasn't hiding. She was standing. For 17 minutes, she stood exposed in the kill zone. a living statue in the freezing wind, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was offering her life as currency to buy a location. It was a gamble of staggering proportions. If she had miscalculated his position by even 10 degrees, she would be dead before she heard the shot. At 5:59, the silence broke. A Mauser K-98 cracked. The bullet didn't hit her, but it was close enough to displace the air around her skull, parting her hair. The German had taken the bait. But for the first time, he had missed. Perhaps it was the wind, perhaps fatigue, or perhaps the sheer audacity of her exposure threw off his aim. It didn't matter. Pavlichenko dove not backward into cover, but left, toward her rifle which she had pre-positioned behind a pile of rubble. In the fraction of a second it took to hit the ground, her mind processed the acoustic signature of the shot. It came from the church tower. She was now in a standoff. The German knew he had missed. He would be pulling back into the shadows of the belfry, repositioning for a second shot or an escape. Pavlichenko didn't waste time with perfect aim. She acquired the dark aperture of the tower window and fired on instinct. Through her scope, she saw a figure jerk violently and tumble backward into the darkness. She didn't celebrate. She waited. For 10 minutes, she held her bead on that window. When a Soviet clearing team finally breached the tower, they found the German dead. A single shot to the chest. His logbook identified him as a highly decorated specialist. Some sources claim it was Heinz Thorwald. Others, Erwin Koenig, head of the Berlin sniper school. Historians still debate the specific identity, arguing whether Koenig was a propaganda composite or a real man. But the reality of the corpse in the bell tower was indisputable. Pavlichenko had outthought and outgunned the best the Wehrmacht could send. However, the war does not stop for legends. Between late 1941 and June 1942, Pavlichenko continued to fight. But the physical toll was mounting. She was wounded 4 times. In June 1942, the war finally caught up with her in a devastating fashion. During a massive artillery barrage, a mortar round detonated mere meters from her trench. Shrapnel tore into her face, fracturing her jaw and damaging her inner ear. She was evacuated to a field hospital, bloodied and concussed. The doctors saved her life and her eyesight, but her war on the front lines was over. At this point, the Soviet High Command made a strategic pivot. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the hero of the Soviet Union, was now more valuable as a geopolitical asset than as a soldier. The Soviet Union was bleeding to death. They were facing the bulk of the Nazi war machine alone on the Eastern Front. Stalin was desperate for the Allies, Britain and the United States, to open a second front in Western Europe to divide Hitler's forces. Pavlichenko was pulled from the mud of Sevastopol, cleaned up, and sent on a diplomatic mission that was just as critical as her sniper patrols. She was sent to Washington, D.C. The cultural collision was jarring. In late 1942, she arrived in the United States, the first Soviet citizen to be received at the White House. She met President Franklin D. Roosevelt and forged an unlikely, immediate bond with First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. But the American press corps was less welcoming. They didn't know how to process a female killer. During press conferences, reporters ignored her combat record and asked about her uniform. One reporter asked if women in the Red Army were allowed to wear makeup. Another criticized the length of her skirt, suggesting it made her look fat. They treated her like a novelty act, not a soldier who had liquidated a battalion of fascists. Pavlichenko, however, was not easily rattled. In Chicago, facing a massive crowd and a skeptical press, she delivered one of the most devastating lines in diplomatic history. She stood at the podium, wearing her green uniform, stripped of vanity, and said, "Gentlemen, I am 25 years old, and I have killed 309 fascist invaders by now. Don't you think, gentlemen, that you have been hiding behind my back for too long?" The silence in the room was absolute. Then, the crowd erupted. It was a masterstroke of soft power. She shamed the Western powers into acknowledging their inaction. She wasn't just a soldier. She was the embodiment of Soviet sacrifice. Her tour of the U.S. became a sensation. She was featured in magazines. Songs were written about her by Woody Guthrie, Miss Pavlichenko, and she became a symbol of the ferocious resistance of the Soviet people. The American public, previously wary of their communist allies, fell in love with the girl sniper. While the Second Front Operation Overlord would not launch until 1944, Pavlichenko's tour shifted the emotional needle. She humanized the Soviet struggle for the American public. She proved that the war in the East wasn't just a clash of dictators, but a desperate fight for survival, waged by women who were willing to die for their homes. She returned to the Soviet Union in 1943, not to the front, but to the training academies. The High Command realized that her true value lay in replication. If they could clone her mindset, they could win the sniper war. She spent the remainder of the conflict teaching young cadets not just how to shoot, but how to think. She taught them the bait tactic. She taught them the duel nest. She taught them that doctrine is a guide, not a god. The impact of her instruction was measurable. By 1944, the Soviet Sniper Corps had transformed from a defensive, static force into an aggressive, hunter-killer elite. The casualty rates for German officers skyrocketed. The fear of the invisible death sapped Wehrmacht morale. Every time a German officer was shot in the early morning light, it was an echo of Pavlichenko's work in Sevastopol. She had institutionalized her survival instincts. But as the war ended and the Cold War froze relations between her homeland and the West, Pavlichenko's story began to fade in the non-communist world. The woman who had charmed Eleanor Roosevelt and shamed American men into action was relegated to a footnote in Western history books, a victim of political amnesia. In the Soviet Union, she remained a hero, but a sanitized one, a statue on a pedestal, stripped of the grit, the fear, and the tactical genius that kept her alive. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, Lyudmila Pavlichenko attempted the impossible. She tried to stop being a soldier. She returned to Kiev, to the very city where her university had been bombed, and finished the degree that the Luftwaffe had interrupted 4 years earlier. She became a historian, a profound irony for a woman who had been forced to carve history out of bone and blood. She worked as a research assistant for the chief staff of the Soviet Navy, living a quiet, almost reclusive life. But the transition from Lady Death to civilian researcher was a facade. In the rare post-war interviews that exist, a haunting theme emerges. When asked about the 309 lives she extinguished, she rarely spoke of glory or nationalism. She spoke of necessity. She reiterated the mathematics of death. But behind the stoic Soviet exterior lay the heavy, radioactive residue of trauma. 309 is not just a number on a page. It is a village. It is a battalion. It is a psychological weight that no human mind is designed to carry without fracturing. She married twice. She had a son. She lived in a small apartment, trying to exist in a world that didn't require her to calculate windage or lead moving targets. But the physical toll of the war, the shrapnel in her face, the concussions, the chronic pain compounded the mental burden. On October 10th, 1974, Lyudmila Pavlichenko died from a stroke. She was only 58 years old. The Soviet Union gave her a hero's funeral. She was buried with full military honors in the WWII cemetery, her casket draped in the flag she had fought to defend. Her obituary listed her titles: Major, Hero of the Soviet Union, Historian. However, on the other side of the Iron Curtain, her death was met with silence. The Cold War had frozen the flow of information and empathy. The American press, which had once fawned over the girl sniper in 1942, barely covered her passing. The political narrative had shifted. The brave Soviet ally was now the existential enemy. Her story was inconvenient, so it was erased. For decades, in the West, Pavlichenko was relegated to the status of a rumor, a piece of communist propaganda that Western historians dismissed as exaggerated. They claimed no single shooter could achieve such efficiency. They argued the numbers were inflated by commissars. It wasn't until the fall of the Berlin Wall and the opening of Soviet archives that the Western world was forced to confront the reality. The records were real. The witnesses were real. The 309 kills were not a myth. They were a conservative estimate. But while her name faded from public consciousness, her legacy found immortality in a different, darker place: the classified training manuals of the world's special forces. Lyudmila Pavlichenko didn't just kill Germans, she revolutionized the science of urban warfare. Today, her DNA is woven into the doctrine of every major military power. When a candidate at the U.S. Marine Corps Scout Sniper School learns to construct a hide, they are using principles Pavlichenko perfected in the ruins of Odessa. When a British SAS sniper sets a hard target trap using a decoy to draw fire, they are executing the maneuver Pavlichenko used to kill the German master sergeant in the rail yard. When the Israeli Defense Forces train for counter-sniper operations in dense urban environments like Gaza, they study the engagement patterns of the Battle of Sevastopol. She proved that in modern warfare, aggression beats passivity. She shattered the World War I mentality that a sniper should be a static observer. She introduced the concept of the sniper as a force multiplier, a single asset that can paralyze an entire enemy sector through psychological terror. The tactic of baiting, deliberately exposing a position to trigger an enemy reaction, is now a standard, albeit high-risk, component of counterinsurgency warfare. These modern warriors may not know her name. They may not know that a 24-year-old history student invented the tactics that keep them alive today. But every time they survive a duel by thinking 3 seconds ahead of their enemy, they are walking in her footsteps. If you travel to Moscow today, to the Central Museum of the Armed Forces, you can find the physical proof of her existence. Behind a pane of thick glass sits a Mosin-Nagant 1891 over 30 rifle. It is not a replica. It is the artifact. The wood of the stock is worn smooth, where her cheek rested for thousands of hours. The 3.5x PU scope is still mounted. The optics that magnified the final moments of 309 human beings. Scratched into the wood are her initials. It is a terrifying object, a tool of industrial-scale violence used with surgical precision. Next to the rifle hangs a photograph. It is the famous portrait taken during the war. Pavlichenko stands in front of a ruined building, her rifle held across her chest. But look closely at her eyes. They are not the eyes of a killer enjoying the hunt. They are not the eyes of a fanatic. They are the eyes of someone who is infinitely tired. It is the 1,000-yard stare before the term even existed. That photograph is her real legacy. It is the face of a woman who realized that the rules of war, the doctrines, the manuals, the orders were getting her friends killed. It is the face of a woman who decided that she would rather risk death on her own terms, by breaking every rule in the book, than die following orders that didn't work. Pavlichenko teaches us a lesson that transcends the battlefield. Survival is an act of creativity. When the system fails, when the doctrine leads to a dead end, obedience is suicide. The ones who survive are the ones who adapt, who innovate, and who have the courage to become the bait if that's what it takes to catch the hunter. Lyudmila Pavlichenko walked into the fire of the Eastern Front and forged a legend that the Cold War tried to bury. But legends, like snipers, have a way of waiting in the dark until the time is right to re-emerge. We have dusted off her file. We have verified the numbers. And now, you know the truth about the deadliest female sniper in history. If this deep dive into the forgotten tactics of World War II moved you, or if you learned something new about the reality of the Eastern Front, hit that like button right now. It helps the algorithm push this history to more people who need to see it. And if you want to join us as we uncover more classified history, hit subscribe and ring the bell. We are building an archive of the stories they didn't teach you in school. I want to hear from you in the comments. Was Pavlichenko's tactic of using herself as bait, bravery, or insanity? Let's debate it below. From the front lines of history. Thank you for watching.